Hello. This is a very important video, I think, because what I'm going to do here, hopefully, in as organized and as succinct a way as possible, is to unify many of the concepts that I have put forward in other videos, many videos over the past few years, towards what I think I have found now is a fairly consistent framing of this ideology of the ideology that I am putting forward, the whole the framework that is here versus everywhere else. And I have commemorated this moment because I've actually figured out a name for it, and I've always thought before, well, what would I call my school of thought? Am I going to call it Objectivism or Communism? See, I'd like to use those words because those are pretty good words. Unfortunately, they've been hijacked by lesser minds, which makes it a little bit annoying. That isn't to say that Karl Marx was a lesser mind. Ayn Rand obviously was. There's no question about that. Karl Marx, on the other hand, was not a lesser mind. However, the word was still hijacked and co-opted by lesser minds that just throw it around willy-nilly without really thinking about what it actually means. That word means anything, depending on who you ask. This word does not. And this word is Complexitism. Now, I've actually looked it up on Google, and I didn't really find that many places where it's been used, but I am not the first person to think of this word. It has been used before by other people. It doesn't seem to be in common, linguistic circulation. It's just something that a few people have thrown around here and there. A sort of a vague connotative meaning, as that's mostly what it seems to have. So, I'm effectively co-opting it from them. Not to say that anybody owns words. I don't think anybody can own a word. But if they come here and complain that I have stolen the word complexitism from them, you can complain, and I will apologize, and I will credit you for the use of the word. However, I am definitely going to use it because I don't see a better way to describe what I'm about to talk about. So, Introduction to Complexitism. That is what this is. It is the introduction to this school of thought. This is the banner that's going to be being flown henceforth until I realize that all of this was naive and foolish and needs to be repudiated in turn for a better theory. Although I sort of doubt that that's going to happen. I think there is some, holistic truth to what I'm about to explain to you that is probably going to survive regardless of what happens. Hopefully, fingers crossed. Anyway, what is Complexitism? First explain what complexity is. Now, complexity exists in contradistinction to simplicity. Complexity is a characterization of a theory that explains something about the world. So, a theory, in order to be complex, has to have few assumptions and many results. That's effectively all it means. As few assumptions as possible and as many results as possible. The analogy for this is, lateral versus vertical growth. You want few assumptions, so very little horizontal, very little lateral growth of the theory, and as many conclusions, which means very much vertical growth. It precipitates vertical growth. It prioritizes vertical growth over horizontal growth. That is what complexity means. Why it works that way, why that's preferable should be obvious. If it's not obvious, let me just explain. The purpose of having fewer assumptions is that it's less messy, it's less clean, and it's more accurate. It's highly intuitive to anyone who's studied science that if a system has more assumptions, it is less likely to apply in the real world. If it does apply in the real world, it's going to be less applicable in the real world, or it would only accurately depict the real world for a short period of time. Hence, few assumptions, many results. Few assumptions, but lots of structure. It's a structure-emphasized idea. The more structure the theory has, the better, but the less assumptions. It's also seemed to me that there's this inverse trade-off. The more assumptions it has, the less structure it has. So simplistic theories, in contrast to complex theories, are theories that have very many assumptions, but very, very little structure. Their results follow almost immediately from the assumptions. So deontological systems of ethics are a good example of this. You have a few rules like don't kill, don't murder, don't steal, etc., and from these assumptions, you have very quick and easy results, and that's it. And there's very little structure to it. There's very few theorems that you can construct with those assumptions, few axioms. It's all very bland and simple and easy. and that is the opposite of complexity. Complexity means it's not easy, it's hard. It has few assumptions, but there's a lot you can do with them. And if you know anything about mathematics, you'll know that that's exactly what they're trying to achieve. Limit the number of axioms, have as few axioms as possible, but have as many results. So, that is a rough outline of what complexity is. Complexitism, what I'm describing, is actually a moral theory, not just a theory of, not a theory of science or the philosophy of science or the philosophy of knowledge, although it is innately connected to that stuff and moral epistemology. That is a whole other chapter that is sort of being overlooked here, but I guess I have to explain at the very least how the moral epistemological aspect of this works. Basically, objective moral ideas are derived in away from moral epistemology in the sense that they have to be unfalsifiable. They cannot be denied. If you have a moral axiom that can be argued against and without inconsistency, without paradox, then that cannot be an assumption. However, if you have a moral axiom that cannot be argued against without incurring some sort of paradox or contradiction or hypocrisy, then you have reached a moral axiom that is simply true. It cannot be denied. Like this is where complexity theory springs. Now, again, this is a simple introduction, so all of these steps that I'm going to go through it's very quick. I'm going to go through them very quickly, without really going into too much detail for each one. And if you want to know more, I'd have to go into more, but it's complex. Haha, pun. But yeah, that's the point, is that some of the connections of this chain of logic that you're about to hear might seem tenuous to you, is my point. It's not actually tenuous, but it will seem tenuous to you if you're not familiar with the theory, or if you're not familiar with the thinking or the style of the channel. So, number one, the core assumption is that a general goal of all life, human life, is survivability, this evolutionary criterion for survival and existence. Existence itself is an ultimately undeniable truth that everything seeks. If a person self-sacrifices, they're still seeking existence, they're just not seeking their own existence. They're seeking the existence of an idea or someone else or something else, etc. But existence is always the goal. Ergo, survivability, existence, is undeniably, unquestionably an ultimate evolutionary goal. How do we reach maximum? So the goal must be to maximize survivability on a holistic, all-encompassing level for individuals and the species, and perhaps even beyond the species, consciousness itself. So, how do we achieve survivability? We achieve survivability by achieving adaptability. Clearly, an organism that can adapt more can survive more. Now, what that means is very variable. Evolutionists might think that adaptability changes. However, there is a certain ability for organisms to increase their adaptability in a scalar fashion, namely by increasing their mental adaptability. If they can critically think and think through problems, they are more adaptable. If they are wiser and more forward-thinking, they are more adaptable. If they're smarter, they're more adaptable. There's no arguing against it, so survivability implies adaptability. Now, adaptability, and this is the big jump here, means this word that I'm going to be throwing around a lot, is complexity. Adaptability means maximizing complexity. It means maximizing one's mental complexity and one's physical complexity. Namely, one must maximize one's complexity because that makes one more survivable, harder to destroy, easier to survive, and more capable of surviving various problems and overcoming challenges and overcoming obstacles. That is the ultimate goal. And everything follows from this criterion of complexity maximization. So, the ultimate moral, ethical goal of all life, all existence, all consciousness will be complexity maximization. How this applies in the real world, these are the next few steps. What does complexity maximization actually mean? Well, like I explained before, it's this prioritization of few assumptions and high vertical growth, which means maximization of the use of resources In other words, the use specifically of resources, not the ownership of resources, but the use thereof, as one example. Namely, complexity maximization, the way it will happen for an organism is through this thing that I talked about a few videos ago called the evolutionary zipper. Evolution, I think, is a system that allows the individual to adapt, but that is not actually entirely true. Evolution is also a system that allows the group to adapt and the entire holistic biosphere to adapt. The way it does that is through the evolutionary zipper, and the evolutionary zipper is actually a complexity maximizing mechanism. What it does is it seeks to prioritize. It's a selective selection process, what the evolutionary zipper is, that prioritizes the engagement of certain evolutionary games over other evolutionary games. The ultimate purpose of it is to engage in as many evolutionary games as possible. However, due to physical constraints, the way organisms work is if they're engaged in some games, they cannot be engaged in other games. For example, an organism that is gasping for breath because it needs air cannot engage in any other activity, or it's less likely to. The purpose of the evolutionary zipper is to zip up competition in non-essential, is to zip up competition in the most essential evolutionary games that needn't be played in order to maximize complexity. The reason it does this is because if those games are zipped up, if there is no competition, and those games are not the ones that are being played because they don't have to be played, there will be more competition within other games, and hence you maximize the total number of games being played, hence you maximize complexity. Again, it's complicated and nuanced, but that's the gist of it, the rough. This ties into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I've talked about for years. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is an example of how the evolutionary zipper works. The bottom layers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs are examples of evolutionary games that are being played between people, or between the people and the environment. Between people and other people, it doesn't matter who the game is being played, but the point is these games are not complexity maximizing games. These games are being played almost, they're almost games that people don't actually want to play. They are games that are being played because they have to be played in order to ensure to move the organism forward towards some other goal, right? The bottom layers, the evolutionary zipper, what it does is it zips up the bottom layers in order to activate competition on the top layer. The simple logic behind that is that there can be no competition at the top layer of Maslow's hierarchy if there is competition at the bottom. An organism that is competing for food is not self-actualizing. It is a lot less likely to be self-actualizing. It's spending its resources on something it doesn't need to spend resources on, whereas it can spend resources on self-actualization. Self-actualization is actually, the other logic behind this is that the bottom layers, the bottom 4 layers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs are not infinite in their desire. Organisms do not have infinite desires when it comes to the bottom layers of Maslow. Shocking, yes, we think people are infinitely greedy. No, they're not. They are infinite at the top layer only. They're infinite in terms of possible ways to self-actualize. They are not infinite when it comes to their desire of other resources because there's obvious temporal, physical restrictions to how much of a certain resource you can have. Too much of a resource and you're not self-actualizing. You're not using all those resources. So the evolutionary... across time, people want more and more resources to continually, upkeep the bottom layers, to upkeep the lack of competition in the bottom layers. But ultimately, that isn't the point. The point is to maximize competition in the top layer of self-actualization, because that is the only layer that actually maximizes complexity. The other layers don't do anything. The evolutionary zipper simply posits that evolution is a layered system, and that not all competition cannot occur at all layers at all time. That is simply a fact. It cannot happen at all layers. In order for it to happen at the top layer, it cannot be happening at the bottom layer. In order to have as much competition as possible, that meaning engaging in as many possible different games as possible, we must be at the top layer, not at the bottom layer, because the bottom layers are actually very simplistic. The top layer is the one that's actually unbounded. Colloquial thinking has it the other way around. We think that there's more games at the bottom because the pyramid, right? There's more things at the bottom, but that's not how it actually works. There's more games at the top. The bottom is actually just one game. It's a game for basic resources that everybody needs a certain amount of. The top is where things are actually subjective. where the number of games just explodes infinitely. The zipper zips up the bottom and unfolds the competition at the top. The whole thing actually looks like an upside down pyramid rather than a, right side up pyramid, like Maslow put it. There are actually more options on the level of self-actualization. Anyway, so that is how Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the evolutionary zipper tie into complexity maximization. Now, what this means on an individual level, on the level of the individual, is to maximize the intrinsic value of their experience. I've talked about this before as well. This ties in immediately into this. Intrinsic value of a person's experience is how they're complexity maximizing, because only during the intrinsic value, only within experiences that have high intrinsic value are people self-actualizing. Only within experiences that have high intrinsic value are people maximizing their complexity. Everything else is very primitive in its goal-oriented form. It's always a means to an end, which means all other experiences have high extrinsic value versus high intrinsic value. So what this means for the individual is that the goal is always to maximize the intrinsic value of our experiences, which in a Marxist sense means maximizing use value over exchange value. Exchange value is not the thing you want to maximize. You want to maximize use value. You want to maximize use value density, rather. You want to maximize, as much use value. You want to get as much use value as you can for every bit of exchange that you go through in the market. That is the way that whole thing ties into some Marxist theory. Anyway, this is how it works on an individual level. Now, this doesn't mean that decisions that have high extrinsic value needn't happen. If there is a potential jump in intrinsic value for the future, then it should be taken. However, the goal is to maximize intrinsic value, and this needs to be recognized as the goal. Now, there is an element here that I have to explain about how that's how it applies to the individual. The question is how it applies to the whole. Well, this is a part of the complexity maximizing theory that is interesting, which is the complexity maximizing pattern is the only truly holistic pattern that exists within evolution, within life, within everything. It is the only thing that is both true for the whole and for the individual, which is a very interesting result. When I realized this, I thought, well, that's a little confusing, because I usually tend to argue against bad ethical systems that the whole is not the sum of its parts, prioritizing a more holistic worldview. However, there's a bit of a paradox in that, which is that I'm presenting a holistic worldview to explain how that the whole works in a way that is different than the parts. However, if I realize the way in which the whole works, then I'm also working in that way, in that sense. Because I am part of the whole, but I have realized how the whole works, then this pattern that is true for the whole, that is also true for me, this pattern that is true for the whole that I have discovered must also be true for me because I have discovered it, right? Which means this is a pattern that is true both for the whole and for the parts. Which means the whole purpose of holistic worldview seeking is that it is seeking a pattern that is true for both the whole and the parts, which is a very interesting idea, because we usually tend to think, complexity theorists will tend to imagine that the whole is not the sum of its parts, except for when it is. That's the point, actually, that the most holistic patterns that we can find are things that are necessarily true for both the parts and the whole. And that is actually what we're seeking. We're looking for that pattern. Complexity theory, complexitism, is in effect looking for the most elaborate overarching pattern that can exist. It is looking for the biggest underlying pattern, the pattern beneath the pattern, beneath the pattern, beneath the ad infinitum, That is what it's looking for. And it has to be looking for that because it needs that pattern in order to maximize its ability to be correct. If you don't know that pattern, then you're likely to be wrong, or you have a chance of being wrong. To minimize your chances of being wrong, you have to make the pattern more elaborate, make fewer assumptions and make more predictions, more structure from fewer assumptions. You constantly have to go through that process and that mechanism, which is exactly what complexity maximization is. That's the beautiful thing about it, is that it's something that is true for both the whole and the parts. So complexity maximization, in effect, is the only it is the only behavior and the only pattern that takes on a very scalar quantity, morally speaking, ethically speaking. It is the only moral quantity that is truly a scalar value. Everything else is vector valued. Any kind of utility, any kind of moral relativist thing, any kind of subjective ethical purpose that people design. All of that stuff is very vector valued because it's something that affects the system in different ways. It's something that affects different parts in different ways. It has multiple variables. However, complexity is a scalar. It is something that is always, more complexity is always better than less. It's a simple, it's always better. At least in thinking, it's always better than less. Hence, it's not something that can be denied, and hence it's something that needs to be maximized. So, what that means is that complexity for the whole is maximized when complexity is maximized for the individual. That is what the ultimate result therein. So, if complexity maximization for the individual means maximizing the intrinsic value of their experiences, then complexity maximization for the whole is a system where all individuals are maximizing the intrinsic value of their experiences. It simply follows. The simple reason for why this has to work is because complexity maximization has a positive feedback loop effect. For example, if I have a society that consists of two people, let's say one of them is maximizing their complexity, the other isn't, that's a situation, but it's not an ideal situation. Ideally, both of them would be maximizing their complexity, because if one of them maximizes their complexity, then the way in which he does that will inspire the other to maximize his complexity by inspiring him and giving him ideas and engaging in the theorizing and moving his knowledge forward and moving forward. So if they're both constantly complexity maximizing, they're always benefiting from one another in terms of where their theories are going. They're always increasing this scalar value. So in fact, they are both literally profiting through complexity maximization. In that sense, this is something that everybody in the world needs to be doing. That the only, the only effectual thing getting in the way is people that don't have the resources to self-actualize, that don't have the resources to maximize the intrinsic value of their experiences, that don't have the resources to maximize complexity. Why don't they have the resources? Because the world currently has a very lopsided understanding of where resources need to be distributed. And that is the purpose, that what decides where resources need to be distributed is the evolutionary zipper. Once again, the zipper simply tells us that certain competition is not necessary because we're trying to maximize competition we are putting a value judgment on what evolutionary games need to be played. Evolutionary zipper is saying we don't need to play these games anymore. We have transcended. Through this transcendentalism, we arrive at a system, a space where we can play more games. So things like wealth redistribution and such, and redistributing resources in specific ways in order to maximize the number of games being played, in order to maximize our complexity, needs to happen. And the zipper and Maslow's hierarchy of needs are the guiding force behind that. So that is, in rough, the system. That's how it works, the way it applies to the individual. Oh, the morality equation. This is something I talked about a few years ago. There's the MAC equation that talks about how virtue ethics, deontological ethics, and consequentialist ethics are all insufficient in and of themselves because everything is weighed against the consequence. Well, the purpose here, the format this whole thing takes for the individual, once again, for micro decisions the individual makes, this takes the form of positive consequentialism. Positively consequentialist ethics are the best. The goal overall is to maximize that the goal is to always maximize your complexity, or the complexity of your experiences. Any action that is taken either to maximize the intrinsic value of your experience or to maximize the extrinsic value to put you in a state where you can maximize the intrinsic value of your experiences. Because maximizing intrinsic value maximizes complexity, so on and so forth, the thing I said before. Virtues come in because virtues are an element of the evolutionary zipper, and they're an element that allows true complexity maximizing feedback loops to take effect. So, for example, they are also indicators of what decision-making process is going to happen next by that individual. So a virtue is in fact a positive consequentialist mechanism in that it tells us what is going to happen next. And it tells us if complexity is going to be maximized next. The specific virtues I laid out, things like empathy, truth, honesty, art and science, these are things that obviously play into the whole complexity maximizing machine. empathy is the way in which the evolutionary zipper takes effect. Empathy's purpose is to wrap up competition at the lowest layers and to free it up at the highest layers. Truth and honesty follow the same metric. Truth seeking as well as science seeking, these are complexity maximizing mechanisms. It's by seeking the truth that we increase the complexity of our systems, because increasing truth necessarily means increasing the complexity of our theories, which necessarily means decreasing the number of assumptions in our theories as well as the structure of our theories. Honesty follows suit almost immediately, because honesty gives us predictable power about whether or not complexity maximization can occur. Things like art follow in suit as well. Now, the only thing I have to point out here is that when it comes to art and how art plays into complexity maximization is a little more complicated and elaborate, because it ties into the theory of art, as the complexity theory of art, and what makes art good and what makes art more complexity maximizing, which is more complicated. So I'm not going to really get into that, but it is, in effect, how the thing works. More complex art is better than less complex art. I'm saying that loosely. That might not ring true to some people who are very artistically motivated, but it is true. If you hold everything else equal, complexity maximizing within art is paramount. And the purpose of art as overall is that art itself is a complexity maximizing mechanism that maximizes adaptability, survivability, and all that other stuff that I mentioned before. This whole thing is, despite my messy presentation, is actually very clean. Every single aspect, every purpose, every decision always boils down to these virtues that always work to wrap up competition at the lowest layers and unfold it at the highest layer, and hence unfold competition at the highest layer, which is how we maximize our adaptability as a species, as consciousness itself. There's no point at which it doesn't work. Now, the only thing about this thing is that this is a holistic pattern, which means it's something that's happening on a very macroscopic level over billions of years, and human beings are themselves included as part of the pattern, and it's not something that necessarily takes place within transient states within the system. So it does not necessarily take place on the microscopic level, and it doesn't necessarily take place on the short-term level. On the short-term and on the micro level, certain strategies need to be employed in order to complexity maximize later, in order to have in order for the holistic pattern to work. But this is, again, this is just the fact that the whole is not the sum of its parts. At the close-up transient level, extrinsic value maximizing decisions may be more important than intrinsic value maximizing decisions. And in that sense, certain counterintuitive anti-complexity maximizing mechanisms might be better, because they actually they will put society into a state where it can complexity maximize later. But that is always how they're justified, ultimately, as just strategies in order to complexity maximize in the future. They are not ends in and of themselves, unless they're being misused and mistreated. But the thing is, even the people who misuse the theorems are still complexity maximizing, even if they don't realize it. That's the thing is, this is how it works, even if you don't know how it works. This thing works through you. So, now that I've explained that, I'm actually going to explain how complexitism as a system, how it works in distinction and in comparison to other systems, and where the complexitist, my version of a complexitist thoughts and vision of a society go into effect. So, for one, you can compare complexitism to other ethical theories, and the point here is that complexitism follows from moral epistemology. It follows from the undeniability of it, basically. It follows from the fact that it cannot be untrue. The theories that are untrue are the theories that are not complexity maximizing theories. They're the theories that either aren't unaware of the complexity maximizing effect, or are not aware of, or are actively fighting complexity maximization. Now, the thing is, these theories are only valid within a micro-transient level. They are only valid within the short term. They are only valid within small spaces. On a more holistic level, they are not valid. They stop being valid as you complexify the system. And complexifying the system is an inevitability, which means that ultimately they are not valid. So, ethical systems like virtue ethics, deontological ethics, negative consequentialism, nihilism, libertarianism, authoritarianism, any ethical system that sees as an end anything other than complexity maximization is an invalid ethical system. This all follows from the moral epistemology side of it. Now, again, deontological ethics, negative consequential, these things can be useful as transient strategy making, but they are not useful. They are not useful as overarching holistic ethical systems. The only truly valid holistic ethical system is complexitism itself. Any alternate system is not a holistic system. So this is why I, for example, as a complexitist, will deny the things like nihilism. This is why I don't believe in things like negative consequentialism or deontological ethics. I dismiss these systems outright because they are not fundamentally holistic systems. They are systems that are less than holistic, which is why they're wrong. They are only right in small periods or small spaces or simple systems. This applies to negative consequentialism as well, mainly because negative consequentialism tends to actually, it incurs a paradox that I'm not going to explain, but it all follows from the moral epistemology side of it. So basically complexitism is a system of objective morality, and it rejects contrary systems of objective morality that set the axiom as that the moral basis of everything starts from something very like a virtue or a system of rules or avoiding harm or whatever that means. They're all or negatively looking systems as, in general, systems that seek to rather than trying to find what's good, they're seeking to say that these things are bad and everything else is good. Those systems are also invalid. All these ethical systems are fundamentally invalid. Next, the question of objectivity versus subjectivity. How does that apply to complexitism? Well, complexitism sees objectivity as a matter of consensus. Again, this comes from the moral epistemology side of things. Complexitism is the only ethical system that everybody can agree on, and that is why it is the only ethical system that is could possibly ever be objective. See, the simple fact is, it sees the question of is there objective morality as a fundamentally consensus-based question. Like in mathematics or science, axioms can be agreed upon quite easily. And in fact, if you really look at what's happening, the whole purpose of questioning whether there's objective morality, of having the debate, the moral debate, is trying to find common ground, trying to find something that people can agree on. Because it's ultimately a question, if there is such a thing as objective morality, it's basically a question that we're all the same deep down somewhere. There is something unifyingly, universal about everyone, and that everyone can agree on, And the moral epistemology behind complexitism would suggest that if such a thing exists, then that necessarily must be the basis for any ethical system. And that is what we would call objective morality. And complexitism is exactly the thing that sits within that, space. It is the only system that is truly objective because it is the only system that cannot be denied by any individual. Even an individual that denies it is actively not denying it in their behavior. There is no object in the universe that actively denies complexitism. Hence, complexitism must be true. It follows rationally from that, and any other system is dismissed either every other system is dismissed as an objective system, basically. Every other system only ever works as a strategy or as a short-term solution or as a guideline. As ultimately, every other system is not a question of ethics anymore. It's a question of how do we get to where we want to be. So, that's how we see other ethical systems. How does complexitism apply to actual real-world things? Well, that depends on That depends on a lot of cases. You'd have to make a pretty important argument. But generally, complexitism would seek to dismantle systems of ethics, systems of thought that are actively anti-complexity, that are actively resisting complexifying their theories for the purposes of preserving some sort of narrative, which includes all forms of religion, all forms of ideology preserving, all forms of ideologies that are preserved under, non-complex systems that have many assumptions and little structure. So the more assumptions and the less structure, the worse those systems are, the worse the ideologies that spring from that. So automatically, this means that the complexitist would be against neoclassical and neoliberal economic theory. Economics as a field of study is in desperate need of it needs to be reupholstered and remastered, and it needs a revolution, because what it's ultimately throwing around, what it's misteaching people is a theory that has very many assumptions and very little structure, and yet applies to almost everything. Hence why it's very bad. Which is why the complexity economists who view the market as a complex system, tend to speak more sense as far as that is concerned, and they tend to take on the more holistic approach as well. Politically, this would mean, what complexitism means is, politically, in terms of, say, right and left, libertarian versus author. Oh, actually, I'll talk about that later. But right versus left, politically, complexitism would lean more towards the left, or rather, it wouldn't lean, but it would agree more so with some left-wing policies, for the simple reason that the left wing, in general, is actually complexity maximizing in its motivation. The left wing is actively living and working through the evolutionary zipper. The evolutionary zipper is working through the left wing with some of their policies. They are recognizing that not every evolutionary game needs to be played, and we need to prioritize the playing of some evolutionary games over others. Hence why they advocate for things like wealth redistribution and free education and stuff like that. That is why they advocate for these things, because these are inherently complexity maximizing moves for society to make. The right wing is the opposite of complexity maximizing, and basically everything that comes from them can be dismissed. The only alternative argument that could ever be made for any kind of right-wing politics would be that any alternative to right-wing politics would lead to absolute disaster and the ultimate demise of everything. The likelihood of that is basically nil, though, so that effectively makes them completely wrong. So if you're a complexitist in the sense that I'm putting forward, the right wing is invalid. Everything that comes from the right wing, everything, individualism, libertarianism, neoliberalism, all of that stuff, it's all wrong, it's all bullshit, none of it is complexity maximizing, it's all anti-complexity. That's the basic thing here. So as far as the complexitist is concerned, all of that stuff is fundamentally problematic in terms of praxeological, ethical objectivity, and can be dismissed on those grounds. Now, so there's also social Darwinism. How does complexitism think of something like that? Well, social Darwinism is wrong insofar as it doesn't take into account the effects of the evolutionary zipper. Insofar as the social Darwinist ignores the effect of the zipper and how the zipper as an evolutionary mechanism, the social Darwinist is wrong, which happens to include most social Darwinists, which I find very ironic, that most of the people who aren't social Darwinists, most of the prescriptive anti-evolutionists are actually the more prudent evolutionary-wise, because they're actually taking the evolutionary zipper into account in their thinking. They don't realize it, but the evolutionary zipper is working through them, whereas the prescriptive evolutionist that doesn't know about the zipper is working against it, but thinks that he's more evolved. It doesn't make any sense. That's the contorted logic of the social Darwinist. Complexitism can be seen as a prescriptive evolutionist system. it is prescriptively evolutionist insofar as the evolutionary zipper is concerned. If you believe in the evolutionary zipper, you are a complexitist and a prescriptive evolutionist. If you are the type of social Darwinist that doesn't believe in the evolutionary zipper, then you're not a complexitist, and you're in fact not. You are in fact working against evolution, and you are an anti-complexitist. You are the enemy of complexitism in that sense. So there's that. That is how complexitism would apply to basic worldviews. Now, when it comes to things like, feminism or basic debates here and there, it varies what the perspective is, what depends on the evidence. But ultimately, the overall goal is to maximize the complexity of individuals' lives. So, if any perspective that isn't motivated by maximizing complexity is an incorrect perspective, right off the bat, because the only overarching pattern is complexity maximization. That is the ultimate truth here. The way complexitism does not agree with certain left-wing views like libertarian socialism and just libertarianism in general is that this thing about complexitism is that complexitism is a moral theory that does not actually take freedom in any way into account as a moral destination or desire or objective good. That is something about complexitism. Complexitism does not care if you're free. Freedom is only ever seen as a means to an end. Now, fortunately, freedom, colloquial definitions of freedom and rights are useful through the complexity maximizing mechanism because conditions of freedom are useful for individuals to discover and discover how to maximize their intrinsic value, figure out how to self-actualize, and go through that whole process. However, it is not an ultimate goal in of itself. It is only a means. The goal is to maximize the complexity. The means might be to give individuals the freedom to do that. So, it's ultimately not a system that condones ultimately telling every individual what to do, except for in certain circumstances where that needs to happen or in case ultimate demise and destruction is underway. So, again, the evolutionary zipper determines where that actually needs to happen, where people need to be authoritatively taken control of, and where they can be allowed to explore their own, maximize their intrinsic value. It all depends. It varies from time to time. The holistic pattern, though, does not necessarily include freedom or not. Freedom is only ever a guideline and a strategy. It is not a goal. From that sense, libertarianism is not something that complexitist agrees with. Libertarianism is, again, it is an invalid moral theory. It is only a valid moral guideline. And there's a difference within the moral epistemology between a guideline and a theory. The guideline is true for transient, local, small states, simple states. It is not true on the holistic level. On the holistic level, the only truth is complexity maximization, forever and for always. That is the only truth. I'm trying to see if I missed anything. So yeah, the only other aspect of this is the theory of art and how that applies to the world. Again, the whole thing is that complexity maximization prioritizes vertical growth over horizontal growth. What we have a lot in society today is a lot of horizontal growth and more horizontal growth because people mistakenly think that complexity is maximized through more horizontal growth. But the reason they think that is because they actually haven't realized that complexity maximization is the goal. If they understood that, they would prioritize vertical growth, and we'd have more vertical growth. And perhaps we could even have diagonal growth. So, certain systems on Earth and in the universe that have no growth happening on them, no vertical or diagonal growth, only lateral growth or no growth, are, in a way, sad and in need of development. The whole point is always to maximize the vertical diagonal growth. And the purpose is to maximize diagonal growth because diagonal growth precipitates more vertical growth, so on and so forth. So yeah, that explains everything, and that should give a rough justification of every moral conundrum and question in existence. Everything is ultimately framed in the question of, does it maximize the complexity of our species? The other thing about complexity maximization is that in purpose of complexity maximization, like I said, the difference between self-interest and collective interest evaporates. It becomes an artificial difference because in the framing of complexity maximization, those two things are the same. One maximizes one's own complexity, and then that maximizing one's own complexity maximizes the complexity of everybody else, which in turn helps the individual maximize his complexity. It is a system that literally works to benefit everybody equally. So it works perfectly, assuming everybody is actually doing that, which currently they're not, but this is the goal of the Complexities, is to create that. So yeah, this is the ideology. This is the ideology. Structural complexity is the ultimate goal. This is the ideology of this channel. This is the banner that is going to be flown forward from now until whenever, because I can't see this, changing. Maybe fucking 10 years later, I'll repudiate all my old ideas and say this was all bullshit. All of this bullshit. Look at this nonsense. No. That probably isn't going to happen though, because this coincides very well with things that I've believed for a very long time that I'm probably not going to change my mind on. However, holistically, I do again think that on some fundamental level, every single individual can agree that complexity maximization is better. You can't disagree that it's not. And that is why it's actually the objective moral, because that is something that people can actually agree on. It's the only thing people can agree on. That is what makes it an objective moral system. And it is the only objective moral system, because it's the only system everyone can agree on. This whole thing actually works. It's actually very elegant and clean in the way it explains and works. It explains everything, every moral question that's ever existed. It's not obvious, I suppose. It's not simple. It's not just one thing or another. But it's very, very it's very holistic. It gives the substructure of everything. It's the pattern beneath the pattern beneath the pattern. So yeah, I'm a complexitist. That is my banner. And if anything seemed tenuous to you, you could always complain. But I'd prefer that you ask questions, because chances are the reason you don't agree is because you don't understand, not because I'm wrong. Because there's very little likelihood of that. So, the only thing I haven't fully explained, well, the only thing I haven't really even begun to explain is how art fits into the complexity maximization. I have explained how things like science and truth do, and empathy. I haven't even touched the art part of it. Because perhaps it's a little less obvious. But I will explain that eventually as we go forward, as certain points of future, as actually I begin to showcase my sort of complexity of my own art projects on the channel. Once I begin to showcase those, I will begin to delve further and further into the theory of art, the complexity theory of art, that it coincides with complexitism. But for now, suffice it to say that art is a fundamentally important aspect of complexity maximization. And that's all I'm going to say. So, now I'm going to finish the recording and go and maximize the complexity of my experiences, and I hope that you do too. Farewell. Cheers.